Okay, thank you, Henry. I would like to thank Chris Van Egeret. Of course, he's not here to be thanked, but I'm sure he's getting wildly appreciated by his high caliber students here at Maynooth, despite what people say. Should point out that I think some of the talks that we've had today have, I guess, been circling around the idea of evolution at a macro scale, the scale of national economies, but also the microeconomic scale of organisations, companies. And this book with Chris Fuller is, I guess, a bit of a thought piece or some ill thought out piece on thinking about evolution and trying to sort of decompose it a little bit. The origins of it come from Chris, in a way. Both of us have moved a little bit away from economic geography into sort of urban planning, urban geography issues, and Chris, I know, wanted to get back into thinking about multinational companies and had got very interested in the evolutionary economic geography literature, and he said, how about doing something? My initial reaction was, I'm not sure I really kind of got this kind of literature. Then Chris sort of prompted me a bit further, written 3 pages, which again I thought was and I kind of left it for a while, and then I suddenly went back to something I read for urban geography, urban planning issues. So this is a little bit experimental. It involves something which is drawn, I suppose, outside of economic geography, outside of economics, outside of international business literature, but it is an attempt to infuse some of those literatures with what I think is an interesting new idea and then build upon that. So hopefully I can sort of illustrate some of that in the talk. So what I'll do is I'll say a few words of introduction and I'll talk a bit about views of inertia and change in economic geography, current sort of thinking, and placing that a little bit in the context of other bodies of literature. I think the main section I'll spend a bit of time on is number 3, trying to decompose change at multinational subsidiaries, and that is where I'm bringing in this interesting sort of concept or classification. If I've got time, I'll try and pass on to number 4, and it's at this point I realise actually what I've written here is actually 2 papers, it's probably going to end up being 2 papers, so I may not have enough time to cover all of this. So I think the interesting thing when one looks at some of the literature here is that across sort of economics, international business, economic geography, these bodies of literature seem to sort of pull in perhaps slightly different directions. You could think of the economics literature, perhaps the sort of history literature, perhaps even comparative institutionalist perspectives as stressing inertia in organisations and in their relationships with public policy institutions. Possibly economic geography, international business literature stresses change, innovation, organisational change. That might be sort of over-caricaturing things a bit, but certainly there are tensions there. I think the paper, and there is a written paper, which you're welcome to, as I say, it's in sort of progress really, tries to make 2 contributions here. One is to sort of decompose change at the level of multinational companies or organisations by using this chap here, Dodgson's work, who's a historical geographer. So infusing a sort of a discussion of organisational change with some of his ideas. And then also to think about how some of the comparative institutionalist ideas about different national innovation systems, different national business systems, different sort of national economic development models could be infused a bit with the notion of extraterritoriality. So the idea that some of the key organisational changes we see at the level of multinationals and subsidiaries might have something to do with extraterritorial strategies of the state. The state is involved in there. I think Frank's talk just at the end there, I think gives us a clue as to some of those ingredients. Singapore will be the other sort of model places we can think about. Okay, so I think one of the things that's worth noting here is that I think economic geographers have been really quite critical of some of the evolutionary approaches that seem to have bubbled up from economics. Ron Martin's work, I think, has been at the forefront here, being particularly sort of trenchant, critiquing some of the ideas that we have of evolution, which are derived from economics. So the concept of lock-in actually serves as a constrained and restricted way of thinking about path-dependent economic evolution. The idea of lock-in emphasizes continuity and stability rather than change. And here we get that sense of economic geographers being much more interested in change, if you like. A stress on different business types, the segmented local economy, if you like, going back to that old term that Thrift and Taylor used, on new routines, on processes of creative destruction. And I think Martin talks a bit about recombinations of institutional routines, if you like, as a sort of prompter of change. I think change is also somewhat implicit in some of the international business literature. I use that word implicit because I'm not too aware of many classifications of organisational change within the international business literature. What we have are categorisations of different types of multinational or different types of subsidiaries. But that's not the same as talking about change over time. There's some view of implied view of how a subsidiary might evolve from one type of subsidiary to another, but I'm not aware of too many sort of explicit models or theories of those processes of change, if you like. What we've arrived at, particularly in the international business literature, and I guess where I'm concentrating a lot of my discussion here is on that relationship between international business and economic geography ideas, and how we can bring those two together. Where we've arrived at, and I think this is as decent enough quote as any to use here, is understanding the multinational enterprise as a basis for addressing wider issues in economics and public policy can't proceed realistically without full recognition of its strategic diversity, how it pursues its global competitiveness, by responding to both the differences between current capacities and locations and the way these locations are seeking sources of renewal and differentiation of those capacities. This quote is also, in some ways, what fills me with dread, in the sense that it's very complex. How on earth do we disentangle this? And some of the worst aspects of geography writing, I think, tries to try and confront that complexity absolutely head on and try and somehow factor that into our theoretical frameworks. I'm not sure that's always a possible thing, or perhaps a desirable thing. That word parsimony perhaps is better deployed. So, economic geography has been interesting, I think, for throwing a lot of innovations about thinking about new organisational forms, new metaphors of thinking about space, so going beyond simply thinking about space or geography as territory, whether that's sort of nation states, national territories, perhaps the network metaphor, or I think the metaphor of the rhizome, for instance. Quite innovative, I think, in a lot of that coining of new terms and thinking how organisations are potentially organised over space. But in some instances, some of those have few geographical analogues, or they're rather difficult to also measure, if you like, or think about how to use these concepts empirically. So what we want to do in this paper, I think, here is to actually go back and use something which is potentially a bit simpler, I think. You can tell me whether it is simpler, but to use a historical geographer's account. And Deutschland's work, I don't think, is all that well known in economic geography or probably well known to historical geographers. And it's one of the few treatments of change over time, albeit that it's long epochs of change. It's about, essentially, its empirical examples are about changes in empires and systems of empires, if you like. But it provides one of the few decompositions of change across the likes of economics, economic geography, whatever. I'm not sure what it's been used, but I think it's potentially quite a useful little classification for thinking about change. But in decomposing change, the interesting thing about it is I think it actually stresses inertia very strongly. So the irony is it's a potentially useful for decomposing different processes of change, but the sort of at the aggregate level, what it stresses is that evolution is an endemic feature when seen in the aggregate, but on closer inspection of individual cases, it is clear that organisations and systems cope poorly with change. And it's that sort of, I guess that sort of tension is quite interesting. Let's just push on, because I guess I'm probably taking a lot of time. On the left-hand side here, you've got his, I think, 6 forms of change that he classifies historical change into. change by reduction, change by expansion or contraction, what he calls involutionary change, and that essentially, to me, seems what economists are talking about. When they talk about evolution, they're actually only talking about one of these types of change, involution. Okay, we'll come back to that in a moment. Change by incorporation or aggregation upwards or outwards, additive or accretionary change, and change by replacement or substitution. These are his sort of ways of describing them in terms of these sort of alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, which you could regard as functions of an organisation, parts of the division of labour, firm capabilities, whether it's manufacturing, R&D, sales, marketing, etc. And what I've done on the right-hand side here is try to link those to perhaps evolving ideas, certainly within international business literature and economic geography literature, of thinking about how they map on to particular parent company forms of organisation. So perhaps hierarchical forms of organisation in multinationals produce or are more associated on balance with some of the top three forms of change in subsidiary level, and the opposite bottom there. So change by reduction, you've got actually at the start of the process there, you've got what is essentially a fully functional multinational subsidiary, perhaps something like I think what some people call a miniature replica of the parent company, with all of the functions, all of the division of labour, all of the capabilities, but over time, gradually shedding some of those functions, if you like, just as an example. Let's run through some of these, and then we'll come back to them. So I'm just going to try and illustrate some of these, or talk through some of these forms of change. One thing I'm very conscious about is that actually the examples I've got here are extremely limited, and I know that already, from Frank's talk there are a few good examples of some of these processes, I should think, from the Irish case, if you like. Reduction, that top one there, I think this is kind of typified. I'm taking a slightly longer term view here than where we are currently, okay, perhaps going back into the 1950s even, and coming forward, thinking about multinational corporations, where they've been based, what they've been doing. That process of reduction, I think, is probably most associated with the kinds of rationalisation that occurred, perhaps in American multinationals, in Europe, where they would have operated in each national territory in the 1950s and 1960s, gradually getting out of that, perhaps that process, perhaps downsizing some of those miniature replicas, moving functions around. That might be one sort of illustration of that, of course. With the arrival of the single European market and the deepening of that over time, I think that's a process that we've seen, that kind of shaking out process, gradual rationalisation, if you like, by some of the largest corporations that would have operated across and in each national territory of Europe. Expansion or contraction, well, I guess the sort of classic branch factory syndrome of simply adding more of the same capacity in another factory, if you like, would be an example of that. We certainly saw quite a bit of that from the 50s, 60s, 70s. Perhaps we're seeing some of that in a place like China in terms of the addition of these sort of massive factories, essentially doing much of the same sort of technological activities. You could think about contraction in terms of the extractive industries, the whole idea of the obsolescing bargaining model that comes with some of the big extractive industries. Essentially a big investment in setup costs at the start, and then that investment gradually sort of dwindles, as does the kind of resource, literally. So reduced commitments over time, perhaps. Involution is an interesting one because, like I said, I think that is really what we're talking about, or what economists talk about when they talk about evolution. It's actually just one potential form of change here. And it's really about more of the same, but a kind of more and more refining the division of labour of a particular narrow set of technological techniques, if you like. So probably the classic example here, and we could think about other examples, but the classic one would be really some of the big American companies which have been rooted in particular technologies. You could argue that some of those tendencies towards introspection and further development and refinement of a set of techniques is actually supported by the sort of extraterritorial strategy of defending American interests through international law and regulation that's attached to multinational enterprises. This is what I think John Ruggie, sort of international relations person, talks about the sort of non-territorial space of the global economy the sort of amount of regulatory activity that actually takes place in meetings at the World Trade Organization or regulatory discussions around intellectual property rights, etc. You know, this kind of change is actually kind of almost encouraged, if you like, by the kind of monopoly conferred by these forms of regulation. A classic example, this is a very historic example, would have been Singer, which, you know, arrived, I think, was one of the earliest FDIs in the UK, up in Scotland, was there for about 100 years, and was basically producing more or less the same sort of technology at the time. It closed in 1970 as it was when it pretty much started. Just one extreme example, and I'm sure we can think of others where the products, the technology involved hasn't really changed an awful lot. How about some of the other forms of change? Well, incorporation upwards or outwards. I mean, I'm just plucking one or two examples here. It may well be that retail MNCs and their expansions into places like China could be an example of this incorporation outwards, if you like. The key feature of the retail TMC is that it must simultaneously stretch both its distribution and sourcing activities over multiple national boundaries. In turn, this implies the need for an unusually high level of investment in embeddedness in host markets. Retailers need to sink capital to physical assets in markets simply to access them. This kind of expansion of market territory almost in a place like China. It's adding much of the same capacity, but in a sort of geographical sense, outwards perhaps one example. Again, I welcome other examples to feed into some of this. Accretion is a term that I've used myself, probably wrongly or perhaps in a narrow way. It's often associated with a kind of literature of international business, regional economic development, and it's probably the type of change which we most associate with increased embeddedness of multinational enterprises and their subsidiaries. It's assumed to have positive implications, that is the addition of new functions. So instead of just being a manufacturing branch plant, you might add some R&D or some sales kind of capacity. I'm not sure whether it's always inevitably a positive thing. This is just an example I'm familiar with, Black & Decker, which existed in the northeast of England since about 1960s through to about the 1990s or so. It had one of the global R&D centres, a major manufacturing centre in Black & Decker's corporation, but the fact that there was an R&D centre there didn't really stop the manufacturing from moving to the Czech Republic. On the other hand, there are positive examples. Things like NCR in Dundee, I think, is often picked up as an example of evolution, if you like, an accretion of functions, of capabilities. I've just got 1 or 2 minutes, I think, just to sort of pass on to the second section of the paper. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because it's pretty sketchy in some respects. One thing I was interested to do is to try and link those types of change that are occurring at the organisational scale, the microeconomic scale, to some bigger aggregation, the sort of macroeconomic scale. Whether we can think of predominant forms of business change existing within particular types of national economy. And this is something that I guess I'm sort of reading around now, but I think the interesting thing here is that I think a lot of literature is focused a bit on devolutionary tendencies, the ability of subnational agencies to influence things like embeddedness. Not much has been said about how extraterritoriality as a sort of government strategy influences change at the business level. I think that's one thing that's worth thinking about. The example I gave earlier was perhaps from the US, a classic example of a liberal market state. The US pursuing its sort of national business interests in this non-territorial space of the international economy. The sort of exportation of US norms in international law and regulation attached to multinational enterprises. I mentioned that earlier on. It's a kind of almost a kind of slightly negative force in a way. Perhaps locking US suppliers into a kind of comfortable position, a monopoly position in many respects, which drives particular forms of change at the business scale, if you like. I haven't got time to go through this ridiculously complicated table. Like I say, there's a paper that is available here, so you can ask me for that. I wanted to pass on, actually, to the kind of topics we've been talking about in these sessions. Ryan talks about the network developmental state, and Ireland is a classic example there, but also Singapore would be another example. These are the two prime examples of where state strategy is being oriented outwards. in slightly different ways, and they're both kind of success stories in terms of transformational change in the multinational sector. So I think Ireland, I guess, noted for its mobilisation of diaspora networks and this extensive networks of overseas promotion offices, etc., working through a kind of almost a kind of non-territorial space in a way, a non-territorial, extraterritorial strategy. Singapore has had very much a sort of territorial kind of strategy for creating a wider hinterland. I know Henry will probably say more about this, but not just in terms of the Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia growth triangle, which is, Phil was talking about as being part of the way of anchoring activities in Singapore, the high value add activities in Singapore. So we've seen that evolution up the sort of value added activities within Singapore, with the lower value added activities going offshore. But you can see there some of the other locations where Singapore has got either business parks or high-tech office parks, etc. That only gives you a small flavour of the kinds of enclaves that exist overseas that are small slices of the Singapore business model, the Singapore economy overseas, if you like. Okay, so I better just wind up. I think the real sort of point of the paper was really to try and stress both not just change, which I think has been certainly championed by economic geographers, evolutionary perspectives within economic geography, but also the immense inertia that exists within business organisations at the microeconomic level, and also the inertia that exists in institutions and institutions interacting with businesses at the macro scale of national economies. I think Dodgson's ideas provide one way of decomposing some of those ideas of change. I think they're quite useful, potentially quite useful. And I think also it's worth pondering whether significant change is restricted to particular types of change at the subsidiary scale, the business scale, and whether it's also restricted to particular territorial and, more particularly, extraterritorial state strategies. And tomorrow, hopefully, I'll have a chat with Chris Van Egeraat about how we can actually do something empirical usefully with this. And I'll stop there.